Everyone. Really happy to be here again. And when Eileen and I reviewed all the questions that you submitted. So thank you for that, because we were really able to shape the webinar based on a lot of your questions. So let's get started. You can go ahead and move the slide there. Anna's in charge of driving today. There we are. It's amazing what a little makeup can do there. So just so you know, my background, I've been an educator for over 35 years. Written 23 books, I think, at this point. But my passion is adolescent literacy. So like many of you, my heart started in the high school, middle school classroom. I was an ELA and social studies teacher and had a career for 15 years in higher education, culminating in an appointment as distinguished professor of research. And now my focus is really at the grassroots level and working in classrooms and in collaboration with school districts. So let's move on here, Anna, to the next slide. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about the ABCs of self-regulation and literacy. And what we know about adolescent comprehension, in particular, reading comprehension, is that executive functioning, that self-regulation, that ability to monitor one's comprehension as we navigate challenging texts is really critical at this age. It's critical at all ages, but it's really critical at the adolescent level. And so we're going to unpack that first and talk about that self-regulation, how we build that. I've heard in so many schools just recently when I was in Ohio, and then on Monday in Illinois, we keep talking about it, is stamina. And many of your questions that you presented, that you shared with us when you registered, were about that stamina and the executive functioning issue. So we're going to challenge, I should say. So we're going to get into that right away. And then the idea of supporting students versus supplanting. So again, that goes into executive functioning. It's not about, is the text too hard? It's what do you do when the text is hard? What do I have at my disposal to make sense of it? And I'm also going to make the argument too that, you know, at this age group in particular, when you think about it, where does 90% probably or more of your content knowledge, your subject area knowledge comes from? It comes from reading. And so being able to navigate those texts is really critical. I remember back in college, we had reading week before we took final exams. And it was just so I could catch up with reading in all of our courses. And then resourcing the right routines. This goes into John Hattie's work, multiple others. Again, it's how do we build that muscle memory? How do we know what to do, when to do it, how to do it when text gets hard? And then we'll have time for question and answer. So I'm going to let Eileen say hi real quick before I launch into ABCs of self-regulation and literacy.
Yeah, thanks for everyone's patience. We are, I just had a little trouble logging on, and I'm here now and excited to hear from Katie and to engage in a great discussion and to get really practical. I know that's the big thing for many of us, is that the research is becoming more and more accessible and more widespread. And so people understand the problem and the challenge at hand. And now it's kind of like, okay, so defining the problem is usually 50% of the solution. And I hope that today we can get to the other 50% of the solution, which is how do you actually address these needs in a real classroom?
Yeah, in a real classroom, quote unquote. So, all right. So let's Eileen and I are all about pragmatics too. So research and theory is all well and good, but if I can't apply it on a practical level in my classroom, it's just, you know, what do I do? All right. So let's get cranking into the ABCs of self-regulation. So we're going to go into that slide there.
Sorry,
oh, you're driving now. Okay.
No, actually, sorry.
You're driving the slides now? Yeah. Where's Anna got them? There we go. Okay. So let's click forward. There we go. All right. That's what I want to get into. So self-regulated learning, I've got to give a shout out to a wonderful colleague of mine whom I do tons of work with. He's my work husband, and Dr. Richard Cash. And he and I have done a lot on self-regulation and specifically with literacy development. And it's this idea of the ABCs of self-regulated learning. So it's that affect, because I'm a Chicago girl, so I say affect or affect. I did look it up. You can have both pronunciations. So I'm a Chicago girl, so it's affect, and behavior and cognition. So these three work together in consort. So they are interwoven throughout learning when we have that self-regulated learning. So when we talk about affect or affect, it's that's your feelings. How do you feel about it? And oftentimes, I'll ask, especially new teachers, new into the field. I'm like, who was your favorite teacher? What do you remember? And 90% of the time, they'll talk about their feelings and their emotions with that experience of, I felt like I could do the work. I felt competent. And that really has profound impact. And then focus on attention, focus of attention. So those targeted tasks are really key. And I do quite a bit of work with centers, stations, rotations at the older level, 4th through 12th grade. And that's what students will tell me all the time too, is that when they come to a center and there is a clearly articulated activity, a problem to be solved, it's much easier for them to pay attention, to focus. They feel more competent. They feel that they can actually accomplish the task. And then motivation. And there's quite a bit on motivation and what draws students in. And one of the things, there's some serious voodoo magic when it comes to choice. And choice can be very simple kind of thing. It's not really all that complex. We can talk about it more in a little bit, but motivation, having choice. We're all going to read an article about fungus in an ecosystem, but you have your choice between toe fungus, zombie fungus, and have a choice between those two. Obviously a 7th grade assignment, because if it's toe fungus, the grosser the better, right? And then behavior are those habits. So the study habits. So almost every single content literacy strategy that's out there is about developing a habit, a muscle memory. So when I get to a text, I'm listening to a voice in my head. I know what to do with that voice in my head when I'm reading. And just a sidebar, when kids have a voice in their head, that's a huge indicator that they're involved in, that they're engaging with text on an active comprehension level, that they're monitoring their comprehension. If you ask a kid, hey, what is the voice in your head saying? And they're like, oh, I don't have a voice in my head. That's usually a big alarm bell. It's going to tell you more than what a multiple choice quiz will be or a reading check. Ask them what they're hearing. What does that voice in their head say when they're reading? And then listening skills, listening to directions, listening to discourse, being able to engage in discourse in the classroom deepens understanding. Collaboration, huge, enormous. Back in the day, when I think Eileen and I entered the profession, we were taught cooperative learning. Cooperative learning is different than collaborative learning. And collaborative learning is that we work together. We still have our own individual work product and understanding, but we collaborate in discussing ideas and developing strategies and new meanings. Communication and literacy skills. So literacy skills akin to study habits. Again, what do I do? Building that muscle memory that when I get to a text and it's hard, what am I going to do with it? How am I going to be able to tackle it, rather than what oftentimes many of us face is the kids just give up, right? They drop the mic, leave the stage. Then the cognition, metaphysical cognition, infracognition, and metacognition. So very briefly, it's that in and out. So I understand this text or this corpus of material that I'm looking at, but what is the conceptual big picture that I'm going to take outside of that? So that is where learning gets really sticky, is that when I can take a concept like change or evolution or story, and I can apply it in multiple different contexts. That's why essential questions are so important, because essential questions drive up to that higher level of cognition. And as we said, as we shared in the first webinar that we did, the part one of this, the 3 levels of comprehension or reading comprehension: literal, inferential, and evaluative. If I keep asking literal questions like, who was Banquo's best friend, or what area was Macbeth the thane of? Those are just literal, simple recall. But if I say, what are the limits of friendship? Or how does power corrupt? Why does power corrupt? You can see that immediately that catapults to an upper level. And I would argue too that it has an impact on motivation, that affect as well, because when I ask great questions that go beyond the question of so what for an adolescent, then that is much more engaging than constantly finding the main idea and 3 pieces of evidence. Why does this matter? How does it impact? And those are the questions that will drive or are such a part of that self-regulated learning. Executive functioning is ginormous. That's the technical term, is ginormous for 4 through 12 as we start getting into deep subject study. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. All right, so 4 stages of self-regulation. The first is model and observe, copy and do, practice and refinement, independence and application. So here's how it works. So model and observe, I might do a mini lesson. As a history teacher, I might show my students how I source a text, who wrote it, when was it written, why was it written? And I show students literally how I look at a primary source document and I make sense of it. Kids need to see us as sophisticated readers, because we're the smartest and the prettiest and the most handsome. They need to see how we think about these things. So we illustrate it. The worst thing that we can do, the Achilles heel, is assuming that they don't know. Bless their hearts. They're teenagers. They don't know. So we have to keep showing them over and over and over again so that they get it. So model and observe. Then the next is copy and do. So I just showed you how to source a document, a primary source document. Now you are going to buddy up with a literacy partner and you're going to source the next document. Now, sometimes colleagues will say to me, yeah, but Katie, they just did exactly what I did when I did the model, did the mini lesson. And my response to that is awesome, because they listened to you. So it's fine that they copy it, because we have to keep copying it until we feel comfortable. And then that gets to the practice and refinement. So practice and refinement, that's the guided practice. You do, I help. And then the independence and application. So practice and refinement, the teacher might say, hey, don't forget to source the document. Remember, I have this poster up in the classroom. Use that to guide you to practice to source the document. And then the independence and application is I do it with automaticity. I don't need the teacher to prompt me to do that. I just do it automatically. Now, if this looks a lot like gradual release of responsibility, you'd be right. Actually, the idea, the concept of gradual release of responsibility comes out of the work of self-regulation. So self-regulation is the bigger one, and then guided practice is a chunk of that. And that's all Zimmerman's work, usually influential in this and in developing that executive functioning for students. Okay, we're ready for the next one. All right, so I think this is you, Eileen.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
your turn.
On the spot. Well, first of all, I just want to reiterate, so much of what Katie has presented here is stuff that may have more technical names when it's presented in the context of research, but we all know that, having students come in and feel part of a community and feel confident about what they're doing and feel cared for is a really important part of creating that community. And that in those settings, students are, of course, going to be more likely to be able to cognitively engage and to, have things that are more accessible because maybe they're broken down, they're scaffolded, but they're there at grade level for them to access. And as a result, their behavior as an academic identity, because they come in with so many different identities as young people, as we all do, they come in with a completely different kind of feeling of connectedness to their peers. There is security, there is certainty, there is, accessibility and also relatability when we create those environments. So I'm going to talk a lot about community as well in this segment here, but I wanted to just go back to something that Katie so beautifully said a couple of weeks ago in our first webinar, which is the idea of supporting versus supplanting grade level literacy access. And this is a really tough nut to crack. And I just had this conversation last night with a colleague who I really admire. And, we talked about, well, we can't just say it louder. If a student isn't able to decode, we can't just have them read something at grade level that they can't access. And that is true. But I do think that the biggest challenge that students have faced over the past few decades has been that with the wonder of technology and all of the great resources that have been produced, it's made it easier to provide more accessible, but we also have then started to supplant tier one core curriculum with the more accessible, which meant that the gap got bigger. So I always say in literacy and in education in general, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And part of the reason why that happens is that kids who already came in with the big Lexile, they already came in with a lot of literacy experience, are given grade level work and they succeed. The students who may not have had those opportunities and access, which is typically what it is, more of an opportunity and access issue, don't then bring that. And therefore, out of empathy, we often want to provide something more accessible, but that is something that happens in place of versus prior to. So this image is one of many images we're trying to create to just simplify how we think about this process, but this is about the cycle that students go through, which is that, if we're trying to help students in the secondary level still access in the content areas, including ELA, which is a content area, access tier one curriculum at grade level, then we have to work not just individually as teachers, ideally, but if we have to, there are ways to do it, but also as a team so that we're using the assessment data that we have. And that can be as simple as having a student read you a paragraph and out loud and asking them what it is. Or again, if they can't necessarily decode, and they can't retell what they've said, what that voice in their head said, then we know we have issues that may be related to basic decoding and comprehension. When we look at that assessment and we know that there are big gaps, especially in foundational, then the next thing to do is not take away grade level, but to make sure that we have the supports in place to help students access grade level. And to make the distinction clear, it isn't just language or skill. Decoding is a language skill. And, the skill of finding a main idea, finding a piece of relevant evidence, that's a skill, that's a literacy skill. But there is also the scaffold of knowledge, and knowledge is usually one of the biggest pieces. And so if I have never been skiing, and I have never even, seen a movie about somebody skiing, then making references to that, even if I can decode the word, isn't going to help. I still need that background knowledge in order to actually make meaning. And so in the context of an essential question, we're creating motivation, we're creating that relatableness, but we also need to make sure it's relevant in the sense that things we don't know about sound really boring. If you're listening to somebody talk about something you have no clue about, can't understand at all, it can be boring. And it on the tier one and tier two literacy supports for building background knowledge and building the scaffold up to tier one that can be done in a tier one setting through a 2-week loop. So maybe the Friday before you're about to read about robots, you're actually building background knowledge about robots on that Friday. So the vocabulary, the schema, and some of the, that discourse community's knowledge is available to the students in a very accessible way. And so that part of it can be presented well below grade level. But when we get into tier one, after we've done that front loading, And we have all of the scaffolds in place with audio support, with in-text vocabulary, with visual vocabulary, all the things that we can put into place to help students access that text. Then there are opportunities to actually interact with that text in print that is at that higher level of language, higher level of skill, and higher level of knowledge is more accessible to students. And just like lifting weights in a gym, you're not going to get there if you never lift a weight. And so doing some of that heavy lifting is really important, and centering around, as you pointed out, Katie, that, the very specific targeted task where the students are doing the cognitive lift. So that gradual release model, the opportunities for the students to have many practices at doing that lift is part of developing that automaticity. And so it's not that there's no challenge, but we hope that if we kind of think about the way we use our time and space and the products that we have, that we can start to do a lot more front loading to build students up to the text versus removing the opportunity for students to access grade level text. And then obviously, if you can build that within a routine, which is a really important part of, behavior and confidence and engagement, that you can also then provide that one-on-one additional support that students will need, especially students, if they are maybe 3 students in a class of grade level, where most kids are either approaching or at grade level, but then there are maybe 3 students who are well below grade level. You have to create a routine if they don't have access to an accelerated literacy block that is completely devoted to their needs. You have to kind of figure out how to create those routines within that tier 1 block. And very importantly, you have to celebrate growth, no matter how incremental it is. If we're not recognizing the growth that students have made and making it visible back to them. These are students who already feel very low self-esteem academically, and having them really understand that their efforts do result in growth is so important. And taking the time, maybe it's a regular time every week. We do it at Think Circa. We take a regular Monday morning and take 15 or 30 minutes to look at what we did and celebrate that growth. And I think that's something that is a really important routine for building community and helping students then celebrate how those front loading experiences and the routines where they're doing the heavy lifting do result in growth, and the respect that each of us has for a person who's just somewhere else on the same map, but can get there and be a colleague, be a peer to other students. I think it's really important.
Yeah,
So
if I can jump
go
in,
for it.
I think like I've got 3 things. So yes. And what you said too about celebrating growth, when we think about the ABCs, that's that affective part, how I feel. And, I say this, jokingly, but I'm also dead serious, is that middle school reading intervention teachers, they need like a full-time, counselor, social worker in there as well, because there's just so much baggage that these poor kids have. And, they've been constantly told that they can't read. They know they're not good readers, and that's why they're there. And so we really just as generative as we possibly can be. And the other thing too, not to go into the weeds too much, but what we know about brain development at this age, at the neuroscientific level, is that when we speak in generative language and we celebrate growth, it actually develops the prefrontal cortex. That's the center of emotions, reasoning, and it gets all kind of like wackadoodle at the onset of puberty. So the more that we can hit like right here, right behind the forehead with like generative language, like instead of saying to students, hey, none of you are on task, you need to get it together, that is perceived as a threat and it fires the amygdala. So you'll get like a flight or flee kind of response or resistant. But if we stop and say, hey, I want to remind everybody of our norms in the classroom, and one of the norms is this, and we talk about it, great job. Let's get refocused. Remember norm number 2, go at it. You'll see much better results. It's almost like the Mr. Rogers kind of magic that we do. And then the other thing too, as far as what Eileen is talking about with routines, that's why I'm a big fan of using center stations, rotations. at this grade level, because that creates those routines, those targeted tasks. And then also we can have that continuum of model and observe, copy, do, practice, refinement, independence, and application. You can actually accomplish that. And then the other thing too, I see, some questions in our Q&A area about, what do you do with different groups at different levels? And when you have kids in centers, you can do that kind of thing. I can bring the kids who need maybe support with decoding or whatever they might need together and work with them while other students are working. And I've been able to accomplish that in some of our most challenging environments to get those routines in place. And what I keep continually finding is that when we do that, kids always rise to the occasion. They do extraordinarily well with it. And I can share that in greater detail at another time. And then I just want to hit on background, how much background knowledge is as far as reading comprehension. And very, very famous study that had two groups of students. One were identified as lower level students on the state reading assessment. The other were higher. The lower level students were actually experts on baseball. They played baseball. They were familiar with it. The higher level readers were not. And so they're given a reading comprehension assessment, and the passage is on baseball. Which group scored higher? Mm-hmm. Yes, it's the lower level students who had the lower level readers who had background knowledge, a very significant statistical affect size, as important as a mom to my students, the likelihood that my children will have brown eyes because I have brown eyes. I mean, huge, like statistically important. So background knowledge is huge, and we can't assume that they know. So building that background knowledge is so key. And that's where deep content study comes into play as well, is that they're diving into these things and developing that background knowledge as well.
Yeah, actually, because we want to make sure that we answer some of these really practical questions about how do we actually do it, I'd love to talk about it and make sure we address the question about content areas. And I can actually, take over the screen sharing here so that I can actually, share a couple of really helpful visuals that we've referenced and that we showed the last time that we were together. And I've heard a couple of things. First of all, in working with partners, found this really helpful. And again, I was first introduced to the idea of centers as a secondary teacher myself, and then district leader when I saw a webinar that Katie did for NCTE, and that's where we connected as part of the NCTE author community. And, just setting this up in and of itself, I know can be a little bit, it can seem like a big lift, especially if you're running a district where you've got a lot of new teachers who may not be fully certified or in a very rapid certification program. So that was one concern that I've heard, and I want to make sure that we address. Number two, most recently, even today, I heard the concern related to, building background knowledge is definitely a very, important piece of work, and the teachers are trying to do it, but they're also very concerned based on various community sensitivities, et cetera, about doing that text search when there are some communities where a lot of the curriculum is being scrutinized and teachers feel like, A, I don't have time, and B, just have general concerns about just making those selections. And so I want to talk about how we can make this doable and how we try to make it doable. So the idea of the Vocabulary and Skills Development Center, this is an opportunity for personalization. This is where foundational reading, visual vocabulary, basic literacy skill development can happen. And that can be the place where the teacher deploys their time on a given day, or they may move through centers and see every group every day and be at a different center. The overview and connect step, this goes back to sort of the background knowledge pieces where there's lots of opportunities to create either text that can be consumed right then and there, or video, et cetera, or this can be something that can happen in the week prior. It can also be something that happens during an intervention block. So both station A and B can happen in partnership with interventionists who are working with the classroom teacher. And maybe it's the reading specialist who is working with a science teacher to build background knowledge and vocabulary before a deeper reading and writing experience in science. It doesn't have to be, again, just ELA or reading classes. The other stations that have to do with just high quality evidence-based reading and critical thinking and writing, all of those pieces can be very self-paced. And as long as there's a routine established, students can move through that when they're needing to work alone and use audio, when they're ready for collaboration and they can share a draft with a peer, and when they are working perhaps with you on editing a piece that they're writing, and potentially getting personalized intervention on writing that they need based on the previous piece of writing. And then this is another one from Katie, the Makeup Center. Students don't always finish things on time, and a lot of times our assessments and accountability are tied to time, which may or may not make sense from a grading standpoint. We may not, we may want to rethink, and this goes back to a previous webinar we did about grading for equity. Can we give kids a chance to turn in things late? Can we give kids a chance to finish up things they didn't finish on time? Because they do come to school a lot of times with a lot of things on their mind, and it makes it hard to focus. And so giving them the opportunity to master is really important. So these are just examples. There are many ways to do it, and there are many ways to step into it. And we have some professional learning on demand resources that we can share with people in order to set these centers up. Wanted to also just touch on the idea that these are also things that can be applied to students, diverse learner groups. So English learning support, multilingual language centers, conferencing with some of the differentiated, I know many people teach in classrooms where it's not one language, it's 30 languages, et cetera. And so these can also be supportive in terms of integrated English language development. We would just simply have different resources or different approaches that we would apply, but those centers can handle that complexity. So if you create a routine and you create a time and space, and you have the resources and the human resources you need in those times and spaces, you can make this happen. And this is, Katie is the true master of this and has many books and has trained many districts on doing it. So while Katie is training everybody on how to do it, we're providing the stuff to do it.
Yeah.
So throughout this webinar, we've gotten a lot of questions about how do we actually do it. And so again, this is just sort of putting it onto a calendar view. So on Friday, we're front loading. On Monday, we're front loading, but then Tuesday we dive in with the class and go into the topic overview. We do the reading. We, may do a comprehension check and then closer reading that's discipline specific. Summarizing, drafting. These are all 20-minute rotations that would work in the center. And then that rotation can begin again. Now, this could be layered into a 90-minute block with, choice reading, independent reading, longer works that are being studied as a whole class, et cetera. But that's sort of like routine where, again, it's predictable for the students, and there are very targeted tasks to keep students engaged. And then all the scaffolds that we need to make sure kids are feeling confident to go back to that ABC. So I'll just wrap up my little piece here by pointing out that we do have direct instruction in phonics, and these are maturity agnostic. So these are not fuzzy bunny. These are things that would work for an adult or a third grader. We really are very conscious of our imagery and the examples that we use. We also have skills practice that is direct instruction, 125 modules with, phonograms, semantics, et cetera, all of the foundational reading skills, and again, developed for 6 through 12 students. We have visual vocabulary specific to the readings that we're doing. So in order to introduce students to not sight words are a separate thing, but to the keywords that will help students access the text for which they might have the world knowledge, like a word like appliance If you show them a picture of a refrigerator and a toaster, they'll know that's an appliance, but they may never have seen that word in print. They may not know the definition, and they might not know what it sounds like, but we provide direct instruction that is self-paced that students can use to prepare to do the actual reading. Works really well and was developed by the English learning leader from Baltimore County Schools in conjunction with us, and many other practitioners are contributing now to that whole arsenal of incredible resources. We then have reading practice, and with our reading foundational work, we actually have reading practice that's specifically designed to be high interest, maturity agnostic, but really geared toward that secondary level, and has the applied opportunity for students to practice in a real reading setting. But it does contain that audio support and in-text vocabulary. And then finally, our direct instruction on skills. These are the literacy and close reading and writing skills, as well as listening, speaking, and language. And then our circus slides, which anyone who wants to stay on at the end can certainly get a tour of our circus slides, which are ready-made presentations for teachers that provide facilitation notes with the gradual release model, as well as a student guide for a blended learning to make sure that student engagement piece on the behavioral and affective are there. And so with that, I think we have some other questions, and I am going to hand it back over to Katie. Whoops, I just got a copy of the questions that I wanted to pull up. And so we have one from Denise, which is, how do we help high school students who are several years below grade level? And then we have some others that were submitted prior to our webinar here. Classroom management, and intertwine that with engaging strategies for reading. How do we do that? I think this is, again, where Katie, you can point us to some great resources that you have and strategies that are more generalized and shareable.
Yeah, so just really quickly. So my colleague, Richard Cash, he has a wonderful book on self-regulation for the classroom, and has tons and tons and tons of strategies and how to build routines, and progressing students through that continuum too of the phases of self-regulation. But in addition to that, one of the most important things that I think that I've learned in the work I've done in classrooms and 35 years of being in the profession is the neuroscientific connection, and how important it is to have clearly articulated norms that are part of the classroom, and they need to be part of generative language. And the other thing too, and I shared that earlier in the webinar, but the other thing too is that I get asked this question all the time. If I put my students in centers, there'll be mass chaos in my classroom. It'll be nuts. I'll have kids flying all over the room. And here's the thing. We're running the show. So if you have clearly articulated norms, and then each center has a point of concentration, that problem to be solved, and written directions, I cannot emphasize enough how important written directions are, because teenagers never remember what we tell them. So we have to have it written down. And when students come to that, if let's say that they're off task, they're not, following the norms or such, it's the classic 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, eyes on me. Hey, I'm stopping everybody right now because I see a lot of folks off task. Remember what our norm is that we take care of each other. We work as an ensemble, and we need to get control of our voices. So right now I'm hearing individual voices, which means we're getting a little loud. So great job, get back on it. And they go. 10 minutes later, that class, it's probably your 9th period, loudy shouty class. 10 minutes later, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, eyes on me. Hey, I'm stopping everybody. And the kid in the back is going to yell, because we're too loud. Yeah, exactly, because you're too loud. So remember norm 2, great job, get at it. And when we're training them, and literally it's training, right? Developing those routines and those practices, I got news for any teenager that I know, any middle schooler or high schooler. I am far more stubborn than they are. So I'm going to keep going at it and keep reminding them of what my norms are. This is the norm. This is the norm. This is the norm. And you know the classes that are going to test you more, you know who they are. But as long as we're consistent and in that constant generative language, you start seeing the shift. The shift does happen, and it happens a lot sooner than you think. So we don't want them to practice undesirable habits. So stop them when they're engaging in those undesirable habits or those undesirable practices, and get the train back on the tracks. So you're going to spend a lot of time in that first quarter, or when you're setting up those routines, to make sure that those routines are followed. So when I go into a classroom November, December, and I see it working like a well-oiled machine, the first question I ask the teacher is, what did you do in September to get the kids working with so much self-regulation? How did you get them to that point? And they kind of look at me and laugh and say, well, and it's always, it's rooted in this, and the neuroscience backs it up as well.
Yeah, there's actually a resource that's found at the end of every one of our circus slides that provides a flexible and resilient literacy routines guide. And in it, there's actually some great resources that we're adding to right now about how to train the students. And so I think that idea of taking that stitch in time, where it does feel like it's taking your instructional minutes and you're like, oh God, I don't have time to teach the kids how to do this. But actually the amount of time that it buys you in terms of keeping kids on task and helping students solve their own problem and be collaborative problem solvers with you is really important, because what it comes down to is we have to design user-friendly environments. And if the environment doesn't allow for students to have autonomy, it doesn't allow for students to have some certainty around what's going to happen, it can lead to some challenging behaviors. And I just dropped a link into the chat to share, which is a link to a resource that Dr. Ross Green's organization provides, Lives in the Balance, which is a really great resource related to that classroom management, because the students who, again, have those gaps often don't ask for help in ways that is recognizable as an ask for help. It sometimes reads to the adults in their lives as a lack of interest or a lack of motivation or a lack of engagement, when there's really nothing that students would like to do more than to meet the expectation that we've put out for them and to be successful. And so to get students to help us help them is going back to the idea of that modeling and direct instruction in how we get up and move from one class to the next. Or how do we get up and move from one station to the next? And what do we do when we're ready to collaborate, but others need silent reading time? So those are some resources to check out. And in addition to our built-in little 5-minute videos. But I want to actually return to one of the other questions that I think we may not have fully answered at this time. I think we've tried to give you some pictures, and we're developing more about what it looks like. And we certainly have resources to implement the decoding and basic foundational literacy instruction. But I think that one of the themes running through a lot of these questions is, how do we make this doable for teachers who do not have formal training in foundational literacy, and particularly in the content areas where they may not have had a lot of instructional training on literacy, period, because they might be teaching math, science, or social studies in a way where their certification or training didn't necessarily involve a huge amount of reading and writing instruction. I mean, frankly, for secondary English teachers, we may not have gotten a huge amount of reading instruction or writing instruction support. So if Katie, you could speak to those two separate things. One is, how do we introduce this to teachers without making people feel like completely overwhelmed, and give them some confidence that some of this can work in their classrooms? And specifically, if you could touch on content areas.
Yeah. So I think that part one of our webinar really goes into that question quite a bit. So, what's most important at this grade level, as we start getting into content areas and such, is really developing that executive functioning. It's important for all grade levels, but it's really critical. So that executive functioning and monitoring comprehension, and there's gobs and gobs and gobs of strategies that do those kinds of things. So if you open up any kind of content reading and writing resource, and there's a lot of really great ones out there, and going through those strategies. So for example, if I want to build executive functioning and I have kids who are struggling, like they are not reading below the surface of the text, meaning they're just really decoding, and that's exactly where they are, and they're not looking at those inferential and evaluative meanings of text, I would start with a sticky note strategy. It's a very simple strategy, and that starts building that routine, that habit for kids as well. The good news is that at this grade level, if kids are decoding, all right, and we'll talk about that in a second. If kids are decoding and they have that, really it's about exposure to text more than anything else. If kids are reading 60 minutes per day, what the studies share with us is those kids generally are going to be in the 90th percentile in standardized test. So it can't just be the ELA teacher, it's got to be across all content areas. So that's number one, is just really encouraging delving into text. The second is with the foundations, that's where, centers, stations, rotations can really be helpful, because you can group kids based on what they need. So if I have English language learners who need some language development and reading development, we start here. If I have kids who need some more foundational, we start here. If I have students who are more advanced readers, I can start them here. And that's where that teacher-led center really comes into play. And there are a lot of resources out there, but it's about knowing how to leverage those resources, right? And communication. As we know, teacher efficacy is the number one factor as far as student achievement. So programs, resources, yes, we need them, but it's really that collaboration between colleagues. So that's where PLCs come into play, and being able to talk to each other about where kids are, and being able to execute and leverage those strategies and leverage those resources. And then that last part too about, in the content areas, again, it's got to be cross collaborative. So when I go into schools, usually what we talk about, the starting place is, I just talk about physical environment first. Let's just talk about the physical, because that's kind of easy. So for high school teachers, you got to get the kids out of rows. That's what we got to do, because that's actually doesn't promote collaboration, which is really the core of this, is being able to collaborate with each other and work together as a team, as an ensemble. So we start with the physical and like chunking. So lecturing bell to bell or teacher directed instruction from bell to bell, it doesn't work. It's not effective. Even universities know that. And they're starting to get away from those large lecture halls, because they know that their highest failure rate are in those kinds of courses. And then so just establishing those kinds of routines is really critical to develop that deep content knowledge and those skills in reading and developing that executive functioning. I wrote too about, we got to break this cycle of learned helplessness. And that is what I see most common in classrooms, is just this learned helplessness, that when kids are stuck, they expect to be rescued.
I want to just voice something that maybe in other people's minds, because I certainly know that when I've worked with, when I worked with 115 schools in Chicago, and specifically worked on middle and high school literacy and the transition to new standards, that one of the things that I heard over and over again is about kind of content area teachers. And again, I say ELA included, because there is content in ELA that is not just reading and writing strategies. It's not all we do. But content area teachers, like, for example, a math teacher who feels that they have a lot of coverage pressure that's probably tripled with the pandemic and all of the years of instruction that were missed. And the idea that this is something that is really hard to have time for. And so I want to make sure that we address the concern that this is not instead of content. This is teaching content through literacy strategies. And so I just shared in the chat one of our signature strategies, which, is nothing new. It's the Freer model. Everyone's seen that and used that before. But it's one of our signature practices. And, again, it's like teaching the physical routines, teaching some of the literacy strategies as routines, especially ones that one content area teacher teaches it, the rest of the content area teachers can also use it. So I just shared an example of one of those signature strategies, which includes an example of how to do a Freer model in ELA, of course, but also in social science, science, and math. And also there's a bilingual example there and a blank. So you can do what you want with it. But those are examples of where we can use the same literacy strategies across the team. And not only do we then reduce all of the confusion and direction giving that might be needed, it saves us a lot of class minutes to use those same strategies. And as we're doing that, we can do things like, let's do a Freer model of what community means to us at the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm.
What is the anti-example of community? What is the example of community? Okay, if we're going to be in a learning community together, what might it look like? That's one of our little on-demand workshops that you can do with teachers and introduce them to the literacy strategy, but also hopefully the strategy for building that effectively user-friendly community with students. So
yeah. If I can chime in too, exactly what you're saying, and just picking like signature strategies. So for instance, let's say that we're all going to, in first quarter, we're going to use sticky notes and Freer model. Now that doesn't mean that those are the only two things that we're going to use. We're going to use other things, of course, but we're going to start with those. So it's going to be commonplace. So kids will see it in a health class, they'll see it in PE, they'll see it in math class and know how to use it. So again, it's building that routine, that muscle memory, that executive functioning. And I always say to colleagues too, because we've all heard the line that all teachers are teachers of reading and writing. And high school teachers in particular, just kind of, you can hear their molars rattling whenever somebody says that to them. And they're like, well, I'm a chemistry teacher. I'm algebra, I'm a calculus teacher. And it's like, yes, you are, but you are a teacher of comprehension in your discipline. And all of these, of course, we call them reading and writing strategies, literacy strategies, but they're comprehension strategies. And they're also, they also not just comprehension, but how do you express what you know and understand about deep subject study and deep content study? That's what this is about. I'm not teaching kids that CH is ch, okay? But I am teaching them how to maneuver in a primary source document because I'm the history teacher. I got a degree in it. I'm really good at it. So I'm going to show that. But that also teaches kids how to go beyond the surface of text. So you're a teacher of comprehension and teaching kids how to express what they know and understand about the text.
And I think that goes, again, to bring it back to how do you make a teacher feel confident who doesn't have experience in this, and to how do you honor the content area teacher's real commitment and responsibility to teach the content area. And I think that Freer model example is just a really good example of how, asking students to think about the difference between a right and a privilege in terms of like schema and framework for then diving into an essential question, like should robots have rights? One of our readings. That's a really important distinction, a right and a privilege. And again, it gives them an opportunity not only to work with the vocabulary, but to do deeper critical thinking. So you don't want to give them 25 Freers because you gave them 25 words. That's not the idea, but to take those key terms to introduce vocabulary in that way and have kids do some deeper critical thinking about key terms gets at schema. It gives the kids then an opportunity to pair and share so that they're developing the language around the actual underlying issues in that essential question. Gives them something to say, something to write about, something to think more deeply about as they are tackling that little, maybe an excerpt or whatever. So wanted to just just share a couple of things that we have. Obviously, we have thousands of things in our in our platform, and just wanted to highlight that one of the pieces that we do, try to support with is some of the blended technology, the old printout, the handout for structuring that collaboration and making it easy for it to be used across disciplines with existing curriculum and not just with our own resources. So I want to make sure, again, if I was going to say it in 3 short bullets, Katie, how do we make content area and secondary teachers feel confident? Like, what are the 3 things we can do to help those teachers feel confident starting to introduce some of these strategies into their practice?
Well, I think the first thing is start small and grow. That's number one. Pick two, just 2, and be awesome at those 2. And the more the merrier, the more of that your colleagues are doing it, the better. The second is model. I think model is the most important verb right now in classroom and effective classroom instruction. Kids have to see. They need to see us as experts maneuver complex texts in our subject area, and that gradual release, and then starting, to develop those self-regulation habits as well. And I had the third one in my head when you said that, and now I just lost it.
Well, you know what? Why don't I just add, I think an important piece of this is making sure that just like the students, that the teachers have the confidence. And so I would also just add that if we're going to model our deeper thinking about a content area, we actually also need time to invest in filling up our own cups on the content area expertise, because again, especially as we're thinking about teachers who are either new, genuinely new teachers, or teachers who are in a very different setting than they were 4 years ago, who are dealing with needs that they haven't dealt with before, that having some time carved out for actual content area learning for teachers, strategy learning for teachers, and also just, working through some of those, how do we implement, for example, resilient, flexible literacy routines that allow us to do some of this complex work. It does mean that you have to take that very precious budget of time, professional learning time, to lay that groundwork. And to cultivate that community among your adult learners as well.
Yeah, and that can be used. A lot of schools and school districts now have PLC designated time, and maybe 2 days out of, X amount of days per month of PLCs are going to be dedicated to this, and it's school wide. So that's something administratively, like, we're going to work on this and this on these days for the PLCs, and then share back, what did you find when you used the Frere model with your students prior to the reading? What did you notice about the kids reading and their attentiveness in class, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, listen, I know that we all have lots to do, hard stops. I am going to stay on and be able to answer questions and provide an overview of the platform. I know that many of you who have taken your really precious time, and there are a lot of you today, need to hop off, and that's fine. But if you are not familiar with our platform and want to do a quick 5-minute demo, I can do that. But I wanted to say thank you so much, as always, to Katie McKnight. Dr. McKnight has been definitely an incredible mentor to me and to everybody I could ever connect her with. And we would like to, again, as we're, continuing this work together, want to encourage you to feel free to reach out to Katie for direct support in implementing centers-based routines. In addition to the resources that we have, Katie is just a wealth of knowledge. And so I want to make sure you stay connected to Katie McKnight through her website, which is full of wonderful resources. And that you stay tuned to our blog. Some of you asked about the previous webinar that we mentioned a couple of times. It's there. In many cases, it's also chopped up to be a little bit bite-sized, chunky. And also, we have a lot of great classroom practices that are captured there, where you can actually see into classrooms how this is all working. So please check out our blog and stay tuned.